You are listening to 91.7 KALW in San Francisco. I'm Farai Chideya, and this is Your Call. Our guest today, Professor Noam Chomsky, first came to world attention through his groundbreaking work as a linguist. His ideas about deep structures and generative grammar continue to have a major role in debates within that discipline. For the past 35 years, however, he's had at least as great an impact as a critic of establishment media and intellectuals in this country and the foreign policy to which they've given legitimacy. He's tirelessly researched, written, and lectured about U.S. policy from Vietnam to East Timor, Nicaragua to Iraq, bringing forward information repressed in the official version of events and comparing the high-minded ideals of the policies with their often brutal real-life outcomes. In his latest book, Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, Chomsky compares this moment in U.S. history not to the Vietnam War era when he first gained prominence as a critic of U.S. foreign policy, but to the Cuban Missile Crisis when humanity had its closest call with self-destruction. Today we'll hear where Noam Chomsky thinks we stand as citizens of a lawless superpower that has embraced a doctrine of preventative war and how we might move forward together. We're very glad to have Professor Chomsky joining us on the line from his office at MIT. Welcome, Professor Chomsky.
Glad to be with you.
We're really delighted. Your book is very provocative and more than a little sobering. And, for example, in Hegemony or Survival, you write, "The principles illustrated in the missile crisis explain why international law is irrelevant. Domestic law was also declared irrelevant. The world did not suddenly become extraordinarily dangerous on 9/11, requiring new paradigms that dismantle international law and institutions." What are the key parallels that you see between the Cuban Missile Crisis and today, and why did you choose that historical incident to really illuminate our time?
Well, a good deal of information has come out about the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile the background for it, it's by now rather clear what happened, and there's a ton of information. The Kennedy administration, when it came into office, essentially launched, first it tried the Bay of Pigs invasion to get rid of Castro. When that was beaten back, it took a small program that had existed under Eisenhower, a very small terrorist program, bombing and so on, and it extended it very sharply into a major terrorist attack on Cuba. This was Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, was responsible for it, and for him it was the highest priority. He was going to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. The phrase is Arthur Schlesinger's, the historian, who was his Kennedy advisor and Kennedy intimate, and also the biographer of Robert Kennedy and memoirist of Kennedy administration. Says the idea was to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. And we now have a lot of evidence on how they did it. It was a very violent terrorist attack.
Well, Professor Chomsky, you are repeatedly using the word terrorist, and as someone who is a linguist, a expert in linguistics, that's a very charged word. And one of the things that you do in this book is you kind of unpack the word terrorist and terrorism. How do you decide when to use that and when that's applicable?
Well, I take a conservative position. Since the United States is the state that has sort of put it on the international agenda, back in 1981, when the Reagan administration declared a war on terror, I just used the official U.S. definitions. So the official definitions in the U.S. Code and Army manuals and so on, which happen to be about the same as the official British definitions and others. I just take those definitions. They identify the most dangerous form of terrorism as state-directed international terrorism. That's what they were going to fight in the early 80s. And continue to call the most dangerous form. In fact, part of the justification for Iraq, the war in Iraq, was that al-Qaeda operations are supposed to be state-directed international terrorism because of alleged ties, which don't exist, between Saddam and al-Qaeda. But that's the main enemy. Okay, just applying the U.S. definitions, the terrorist attack against Cuba, which was very serious, blowing up petrochemical plants, killing hundreds of people, sinking fishing boats, killing people, strafing hotels and killing dozens of people, and so on and so forth, poisoning crops and livestock. All of those are straight terrorist activities. I mean, that's what we'd call them if anyone was doing it to us.
But certainly we don't think of ourselves as a terrorist state.
Well, if we're honest, we will use the same standards for ourselves that we use for others. That's true in personal life, and it's true in international affairs.
You say that international law is irrelevant. That is a very strong statement. Has international law ever been more relevant? Is this a new thing, or has this always been true?
Well, it's not that it's irrelevant. It's just, international law has no enforcing agency. National law has a police force. Okay, you drive too fast, you can be arrested. Okay, there's no enforcing agency for international law.
Not the UN, not anyone else?
No, the UN can't act unless the great powers, meaning primarily the U.S., permit it to. The UN itself isn't a police force, has no policing powers. It has to be granted them by a Security Council decision. That means by the 5 great powers, which have veto power, and the United States overwhelmingly among them. So unless there is some enforcement through the Security Council, the UN cannot enforce international law. Well, in this case, actually, Cuba tried to get the UN involved, but the United States just refused. So the UN never got involved, so therefore it was no enforcement. Therefore, the U.S. was able to carry out an international terrorist attack in violation of international law with complete impunity. Same thing happened in the Reagan administration. There it was more extreme, in fact. The Reagan administration carried out a terrorist war against Nicaragua. Nicaragua brought it to the World Court, the International Court of Justice, and won its case. The International Court of Justice in 1986 condemned the United States for, the official phrase is, unlawful use of force in international affairs. That's the official term for international terrorism. Ordered the U.S. to stop the crime and to pay enormous reparations.
Can you compare this to today? Is there a terrorist?
Let me just go on with this one a minute.
Okay.
Just 1 second. The United States defied the World Court ruling, said we're not going to accept it. It intensified the war. Of course, it didn't pay reparations. Nicaragua then took the issue to the Security Council, which passed, that's the highest authority, which passed 2 successive resolutions reaffirming the court judgment and calling on all states to observe international law. The U.S. vetoed both of them, so therefore there's no enforcement. But that's international terrorist criminality at the state level. In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't know if you want to go through the details, that's the background for the missile crisis. Cuba finally tried to move to some means of self-defense. The Russians crazily put missiles into Cuba, thinking they could somehow deter the United States from attack. That led to the missile crisis. It practically blew up the world. So these are very contemporary issues. In fact, the Iraq invasion, exactly as was predicted by every intelligence agency and specialist, increased the threat of terror. The new high-level report came out today concluding that, yes, exactly as we sort of see in front of our eyes, it increased the threat of terror, as had been predicted.
Well, has U.S. policy in Iraq been a radical departure with previous U.S. policy, or is it a continuation of U.S. policy?
Well, in some respects, it's a departure. It's the first case of direct aggression in which there has been no credible pretext of protecting anyone against aggression. So, for example, the invasion of South Vietnam at the same time as the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Kennedy administration invaded South Vietnam in 1962. Go into the details if you like. But then there was a pretense that it was a defense against what was officially called internal aggression. A crazy idea. But that was the official idea. There's internal aggression in Vietnam, and we have South Vietnam, and we have to protect South Vietnam from what Kennedy called the assault from the inside. Well, that can't be taken seriously, but it was. However, at least then there was a pretext of defense. In the case of the Iraq War, there was no pretext. It was just invasion. So yes, it's different. That's one of the reasons why there was such enormous criticism of it, and not only in the world public, where it was just overwhelming, but even in the foreign policy elite inside the United States. So the main conservative foreign policy journals and others did criticize it. I mean, they sort of went along, but they said this is a radical departure. The doctrine on which it was based, the so-called preemptive war doctrine, Henry Kissinger described it as, in his words, a revolutionary new doctrine, which tears to shreds the whole international framework of order since the 17th century, and of course the UN Charter and international law. So it was recognized to be a departure, but in my opinion, frankly, it's not that much of a departure. It's just that this time there wasn't even a pretext of defense.
You mentioned the role of the media and intellectual elites who have, by their own admission in some cases, for example, with the New York Times editorial yesterday, acted more like endorsing bodies than critical investigators. What are the countervailing forces to this? Who should be and who is providing a balance to elites and media that simply act as rubber stamps?
Well, first of all, let me point out that that New York Times piece yesterday confessing their sins simply evaded all the issues. What they were talking about were very minor deviations. There are much more serious ones, which they just suppressed. But putting that aside, the counterforce, I think there was an important front page story in the New York Times on, must have been February 16th, 2003, which told us who the counterforce is. This was after, the day after, or maybe 2 days after, the huge demonstrations all over the world, including the United States, tens of millions of people, protesting the coming invasion of Iraq. Now, that was a very important event, not only because of its scale, but also because of its timing. I mean, it's the first time in the history of not just the United States, but the history of European imperialism that goes back centuries. This is the first time that there has ever been large-scale public protest against a war before it was launched. Sometimes there's protest later, but not before it's launched. Well, the day after, the Times reported that, as they put it, there are now two superpowers on the planet. One is the U.S. government. The second is world public opinion, and that's the countervailing force. Of course, that's got to become an important force inside the United States. Otherwise, it's not going to be effective.
So do you believe that it did have any effect? Obviously, the U.S. still went to war, and the U.S. is only now and very reluctantly accepting the idea of there being a truly multinational force in Iraq.
It had a huge effect. I mean, just compare today with 1962, okay? 1962, Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to bomb South Vietnam. It was public, but nobody cared. Authorized the use of napalm. Began to use chemical warfare to destroy crops, began programs which were supporting the guerrillas, began programs to drive, ultimately it was millions of people, into what amounted to concentration camps to separate them from the guerrillas who the U.S. knew they were supporting. That's aggression. Did anybody pay attention? There was no protest. I mean, tiny protests. Nobody took notice. It was public, but nobody cared. So therefore, they could go on for years, escalating the attack. B-52 raids on densely populated areas, massive mass murder operations, of which My Lai was a tiny footnote, and so on for years. I mean, they ended up virtually destroying South Vietnam, which was the main target of the attack, and then spread the war to the rest of Indochina. Now they can't do that. They can carry out a very quick attack by first frightening the population here so a fair number of people will accept it. But then they can't hang on. I mean, they're not bombing Iraq with B-52s. They're not carrying out things like the so-called pacification campaigns, mass murder operations in Iraq. They're constrained, and they have to back off. Partly they're constrained just by the fact that Iraqis won't accept it. But very much they're constrained by internal changes in the United States. U.S. population won't accept it anymore. And they're well aware of this. We know from leaks that they are well aware of it. So just to give an example, when any new president comes in, the first thing he does is get an evaluation of the world situation from the intelligence community, CIA and others. Usually we don't learn about it for 35 or 40 years until it's declassified. In 1989, when Bush #1 came in, someone in intelligence or in the Pentagon leaked a piece of it to the press, and it was very interesting. It was barely mentioned, but it was there. What it said, it was a section of the analysis which referred to what they called conflict with much weaker enemies. Now, the only country the U.S. is going to attack is a much weaker enemy, nobody else. So this has to do with any possible conflict.
Professor Chomsky, finish up this answer after a short break. You are listening to Your Call, and we are speaking with author and professor of linguistics, Noam Chomsky, whose most recent book is Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance. Welcome back to Your Call. I'm Farai Chideya, and I am speaking with Noam Chomsky, author, professor, and whose most recent book is Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance, which takes a look at America's history of foreign policy, how it affects the international sphere, and whether or not we can survive our own weapons of mass destruction. What do you think? Give us a call at 415-841-4134, 415-841-4134. What questions do you have for Professor Chomsky? If you're listening online, you can call us toll-free, 866-798-TALK. That's 866-798-8255. Professor Chomsky, you have been writing prolifically for years, and from what we understand, the first article you ever wrote in 1939 at age 10 was an editorial in your school paper about the fall of Barcelona and the defeat of the Republican forces in the Spanish Civil War. You talked about the way that the Republicans in Spain drew support from fighters around the world. How would you compare that moment in Spanish history to what we're seeing in Iraq today, where the resistance is drawing support from fighters far-flung around the world? Is there any parallel there?
No, not really. I mean, what was happening in Spain was a fascist attack, originally from Morocco, against the government of Spain. The fascist attack, the Franco attack, was supported quite openly by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and the question was whether the Western democracies would support the democratic Spanish government. Well, they refused. And what then happened was foreign volunteers, like the American Lincoln Brigade in the United States and others in Europe, went to support the Spanish government. But and nothing like that is happening in Iraq now. I mean, nothing remotely like it. The other huge difference is that in Spain, and this is really what interested me as a child and still does, there was a popular revolution, a major popular revolution, an anarchist revolution, which took over much of the country, put it under pure democratic control by working people in factories, peasants and collectives and so on. And that was attacked by every force in the world. It was attacked by the fascists, it was attacked by Russia under Stalin, and it was attacked by the Western democracies. None of them would tolerate a free, democratic, popular revolution in Spain. And it was only after that revolution was destroyed that the international conflict really took off. And then came the refusal of the United States, Britain, and France to support the government, and then came in the foreign volunteers. Well, again, in Iraq, there's nothing remotely like that going on. So the only similarities are pretty vague, namely the support for international terrorism in Spain by the Nazis and the Italian fascists. I mean, that's analogous, you might say, but it's totally different in every important respect.
Professor Chomsky, we have got the first of many callers for you. Kirsten in San Francisco, good morning and welcome to Your Call.
Good morning, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm the organizer of a local group here in San Francisco called Persons Incorporated. And we believe that corporate domination, by virtue of corporate constitutional rights, like the First Amendment, is the driving force behind the war in Iraq and U.S. foreign policy in general. among other things. And I'd like to know if you think if it's possible to revoke corporate constitutional rights in the U.S., and if so, do you think it'll make a big difference?
We should be. I think you're hitting on a very important point. Those corporate rights are not really constitutional rights. They were never granted by legislation. The courts, about a century ago, the courts basically made a decision, a fateful decision, to assign personal rights to massive totalitarian entities. That's what corporations are. So they get the rights of persons, like the rights of free speech, the rights of freedom from search and seizure, so they remain unaccountable to the public, and so on. That was a major assault on classical, liberal policies. I mean, Adam Smith and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson would have turned over in their graves. And that is now extended so that corporations by now have rights far beyond persons of flesh and blood. But to call them constitutional rights is a little misleading. Now, getting to your point, yes, of course, any state, every corporation is chartered in a state. The state can withdraw that charter. In fact, almost happened in California in a recent case. There was a legal case began calling on the Attorney General of California to carry out his constitutional duty to revoke the charter of Unocal, major oil company, because of crimes that it was committing in California and in Burma, where it was using slave labor and so on. And they had a pretty good case. And it started going through the courts. The Attorney General conceded that, yes, he had the right to revoke the charter. In fact, I think he had the duty to revoke the charter under his own legal requirements. But finally, the courts wouldn't accept it, though it was a very plausible case. And yes, that can be done in any place. There is no constitutional basis for the existence of these tyrannies which dominate the society and by now the world. And of course, dominate the political system. That's not a big secret.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'd like to turn now to John in San Francisco. Welcome to your call.
Hello, Mr. Chomsky, Faria. My question is, I've observed in the media, particularly when your name comes up, that a lot of people will smear you really with this brush that you're a conspiratorialist and that you believe that, as Tom Wolfe said in Manufacturing Dissent, that, there's a bunch of people with cigars in a big room that are plotting the course of, world affairs. And I think they haven't read your stuff if they think that. But my question deals with the fact whether you feel somewhat inhibited in your approach to things out of interest of not to be painted that way, specifically with, September 11th. I've been following the commission hearings, and if you were listening at all to Pacifica, it seems like a lot of the people, progressive commentators, are very hostile to people when they bring up certain points, unanswered questions of 9/11, and almost feeling like they need to stand up more than the people from the right and denounce those people. And I'm curious whether you feel, inhibited in that respect.
Thanks, John.
No, not in the least. I expect people like Tom Wolfe, who understands that he can't give arguments and he doesn't know any of the facts, so all he can do is have a tantrum. So what he does is have a tantrum and try to find some way to shut people up whose views he doesn't like. Yeah, that's what you expect. If someone has arguments or has some evidence, I'm delighted to hear it. But if people just have tantrums, it's of no interest. In fact, in the book that he's talking about, Manufacturing Consent, if you look at it, you'll see that my co-author and I don't suggest any conspiracy at all. We just give a institutional analysis of the traditional conservative kind, and from that institutional analysis of the structure of the media and the way they work and so on, we draw some natural conclusions about what you would expect. And then we give a lot of evidence showing that's exactly what you have. That's called science. That's not a conspiracy theory. Tom Wolfe doesn't like the results, and he knows he can't answer it, so he screams. That's not inhibiting. With regard to 9/11, actually, if you follow these things, I'm well known as being an opponent of conspiracy theories. So Tom Wolfe's comment is a bit ironic. But in the case of 9/11, yes, it's true. Many people are looking for a conspiracy behind it, and I'm very skeptical about that. I don't see any basis for it.
All right, we are speaking with Professor Noam Chomsky, Professor of Linguistics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, whose most recent book is Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance. I'd like to turn now to Ricardo in San Francisco. What is your question for Professor Chomsky?
Oh, hello, Farai. Good morning.
Good morning.
And to Mr. Chomsky, you have been a very indispensable human being looking at these world affairs for so many years, and I thank you extremely, first of all. I would like to ask, in the book Propaganda in the Public Mind, you've made an assessment of American policies and so forth, where Roosevelt actually said admirable things about Mussolini. And during the period of the 1938 issues with doctors' looks at this situation, A.A. Burrell, Roosevelt mentioned that they were interested in seeing what Hitler could do to forestall the Russian Revolution moving into a particular swing to the left, that Roosevelt actually advised that the Nazi Party would be doing a favor to the world. And I'm wondering what the connection is between psychology and the aberrant behavior of this administration and the movement toward what is going on with ascendancy to a world doctrine.
Thank you, Ricardo. Let's let Professor Chomsky answer.
Well, I should say that, yes, that material is in the book you saw, but that book is kind of transcripts of interviews. If you want real sources, then you have to look at actual books. So, and actually in this recent book of mine that you mentioned before, there's a lot of documentation about it, also in earlier books. It's perfectly true that Roosevelt and the progressive opinion generally was pretty favorable to Mussolini and fascism right to the end. And with regard to Hitler, he was perceived as a moderate, standing between the left and the right, who was preventing the masses of the population in Germany, the labor movement and others, from moving to the left. So he got some moderate support, both from the British and the United States, right up to the war. But now, this administration, I think this administration is about the opposite extreme from the Roosevelt administration within the pretty narrow framework of American politics. And this administration is so extreme that even mainstream conservatives are condemning it, pointing out that its arrogant, brazen actions, visible contempt for others, its immediate resort to violence, are really harming the United States. And you can see that.
Professor Chomsky, let me just ask you quickly about your endorsement of Senator John Kerry for the presidency. You say that you admire the principles of people like Nader, but you, at this point, are very strongly in support of regime change in America. How did you make that decision, given your politics?
Well, first of all, I didn't exactly endorse Kerry. I said it's important. I think it's very important to get rid of the gang around Bush. I think they're very dangerous people. They can cause immense harm in international affairs and are doing it. But they're also dismantling. They're very intent on dismantling within the United States, dismantling the whole structure of progressive legislation that goes back to Roosevelt, the New Deal measures, the Great Society measures. In fact, they've already largely succeeded in getting rid of progressive taxation, which goes back a century. And they're very dedicated to that, and I think that's very harmful. And I think it's important to prevent them from getting another mandate. Well, in the real world, that means voting for making sure that the Democrats get more votes than they do. What about Nader? Well, in my view, is pretty much the same as in the year 2000 when I thought the same thing, but now it's more obvious, I think. A vote for Nader, I'll probably personally vote for Nader in Massachusetts. The reason is it's not a swing state. The outcome is essentially determined, so you can therefore vote more or less on principle, not on tactics. If it was a swing state, I'd vote against Bush. That means for Kerry. It's called tactical voting. I think that makes sense. There are also other methods that can be used. Some of them have, for example, there's a very well-known constitutional lawyer at Yale University, Bruce Ackerman, who pointed out that one thing Nader could do is pick Democratic electors. Remember, in the United States, people don't elect the president. People elect electors. The electors elect the president. If Nader were to say, okay, I pick the same electors as the Democratic Party, then a vote for Nader would go to the Democratic Party. And that way you could both register a vote for Nader, helping to build maybe a long-term political alternative, and yet at the same time keep Bush from getting another mandate.
Fascinating.
There are other mechanisms for doing this, and I think it is important in my opinion.
Let's turn to Chris in San Francisco. Welcome to your call.
Good morning. I'm wondering if you could take sort of a cosmic spiritual outlook as a prediction for the planet, knowing the forces so well as you do, the destructive as opposed to the ones that build a world for us. Do you think the planet is on a self-destruct, is on an extinction?
Thanks, Chris.
Well, there certainly are tendencies underway which could destroy not the planet, but could destroy the human species and a lot more with it. We didn't really, I mean, as it was mentioned, during the Cuban Missile Crisis 40 years ago, we came virtually to the point of a nuclear war, which Eisenhower had said would correctly might destroy the Northern Hemisphere. And of course now it's far more dangerous. And those dangers of nuclear war are being sharply enhanced by the Bush administration. That's one of their greatest dangers, in my opinion. So yes, destructive war, which is always imminent, unfortunately, that could have a devastating effect. Environmental destruction is, not going to be that as quick as nuclear war, but it's looming. It's becoming a very serious problem and cannot be delayed. There are others that are different in character, but could be quite serious, like the reliance of the society, our industrial societies, on hydrocarbon-based energy like oil. That's extremely dangerous, not only because of the environmental effects, but because it's a terminating resource.
Professor Chomsky, let's continue our conversation after the break. I'm Farai Chideya. You're listening to Your Call, and I'll be back to take your calls with Noam Chomsky after this break.
On KALW San Francisco, it's 10:40. Coming up at 11, it's the Tavis Smiley Show at noon. It's Alternative Radio, Larry Everest on oil, power, and empire. At 1 o'clock, it's Open Air. I'll be talking with Stephen Pickover, who is the stage director for Fidelio, being given a staged concert production this week by the San Francisco Symphony. That's coming up at 1 o'clock on Open Air on Information Radio, KALW San Francisco. And now back to Farai Chideya.
Welcome back to Your Call. We are speaking with MIT Professor of Linguistics Noam Chomsky about his most recent book, Hegemony or Survival, what should you 415-841-4134. That's 415-841-4134, or toll free 866-798-TALK, 866-798-8255. In these dangerous times, how do we preserve our commitment to humanity over global dominance?
Hi, Dr. Chomsky. It's an honor to talk to you. First, I want to say that I agree with you with virtually everything I've ever heard you say. I think you're the premier political analyst on the planet. However, I would like to discuss what you think is a solution to all these problems. And here's the problem that I run into, and I've been beating my head against the wall as a admittedly sometimes activist for probably the last 20 or 30 years. I think we live in a country where people basically came here. I know people have come here for all different reasons, but I think if not a majority, at least the plurality of people have come here basically to get rich. And so we live in a country that's made up of people who are unusually selfish and greedy and materialistic, and I don't see any way to change things in any significant way without changing that. So that's where I'm sort of stuck, and I'd like to know what you think about that and what we can do about it.
Well, I have a much more optimistic view of people. I mean, I come from first-generation immigrant family. They were Jewish, working-class, first-generation immigrants. I mean, yeah, they came here to escape persecution, and they were hoping to enjoy privilege, but they were very dedicated to helping other people. This is the 1930s. I mean, these were the people who were actively engaged in building the CIO, in creating the popular basis which drove the Democratic Party to establish the New Deal measures, which have significantly improved life for a lot of people. And it continues right up to the present. So, in fact, today, the popular movements committed to bringing about significant change and really working hard on it, they're larger than they've ever been, including a lot of young people. I mean, some of the things happening now just have no historical precedent. The protest against the Iraq War was one of them, and it had a big effect. Or take, say, the global justice movements, what are ridiculously called anti-globalization movements. Those are movements calling for real international programs of solidarity, support, development. They're very concrete proposals, which are for the first time popular-based at a mass level all around the world. That's a tremendously exciting development. And if you just look at this country itself, we're a much more civilized country than we were 40 years ago, almost in any dimension you think of. I mean, take, say, women's rights, rights of minorities, environmental concerns. Just go around across the list. It's all very different from what it was 40 years ago and much more civilized. And the reason is that people dedicated themselves with commitment and courage to bringing about changes. A lot of young people were in the forefront. And there's no reason for that to stop. That's gone way back in history. It's how we got rid of slavery, feudal systems and so on. And there's no particular reason for it to stop. Yes, there are major efforts made to drive people towards passivity, apathy, helplessness, wild consumerism, and so on. Those are all efforts at control, and they're being used extensively precisely because enough victories have been won, thanks to the courage of our predecessors. Enough victories have been won that people cannot be controlled by force anymore. So it's necessary to try to control their attitudes and beliefs. Well, controlling attitudes and beliefs may be hard to deal with, but it's nothing like the pressure of the torture chambers and security forces and so on and so forth. We're very lucky, thanks to the struggles of our predecessors.
Professor Chomsky, let me just ask you about some of the individual acts of courage that some people have taken, and I'm going to butcher his name. I apologize in advance. Vasily Arkhipov. You mentioned him in Hegemony or Survival. Just tell us a little bit about who he was and what does his story sort of exemplify for us today.
Well, one of the things, there was a 40th anniversary meeting in Havana in 2002, 40th anniversary of the missile crisis. Had all sorts of high-level participants. They discovered some shocking things. One is this. It turned out that no one knew at the time that Russian submarines near Cuba were equipped with missiles, torpedoes with nuclear weapons, nuclear-armed torpedoes. At the peak of the missile crisis, when it was really dangerous, Russian submarines came under attack by U.S. destroyers. Now, according to the Russian rules of engagement, 3 submarine commanders have to authorize a nuclear strike. The submarine commanders assumed that a general war was going on. 2 of them authorized launching a nuclear-tipped torpedo. That probably would have set off a nuclear war. The 3rd one, Vasily Arkhipov, countermanded the order. That's probably why we're alive today. It was that close.
Very dramatic and very sobering again. Let's turn back to our callers. We've got John in San Francisco. Welcome to your call.
Hi, and Dr. Chomsky, thank you just for your overall work, both in linguistics and, if I can say, in politics and community. I appreciate all you've done over the years.
Thank you.
A question regarding the Israeli-Palestinian crisis or conflict. Do you have any thoughts on what a viable solution is, and do you support a single-state solution, which seems to be what Falk Bernadotte was getting at back in the late 40s.
Thank you, John. We have another caller who I believe is on the same topic. Aid in Berkeley, welcome to your call.
I'd like to ask Professor Chomsky about the connection between the Likud party in Israel and the neocons, people like Pearl and Wolfowitz and Gaffney and so on. And I'd like to just remind everybody the word neocon comes from the New Conservative Journal, which is Jewish committee publication started in 1969 by Norman Bothurst and I believe Irving Kristol as well. I'd love to hear his comment about my question, the relationship between the Likud party, which the eventual effect of their politics will actually be reversed on Israel, because the long-term survival of Israel does not depend on Sharon or Bush. I believe both of them are the worst enemies Israel ever had.
Thank you, Aid, and thank you, John. Professor Chomsky?
Well, to begin with the first one, is there a settlement on the horizon? Yeah, I think so. In fact, there was a very good I don't think any of the current alternatives are very good, frankly. But the least bad of them, and the one that could end the cycle of violence and maybe lead on to something better, was announced in Geneva, Switzerland, last December 1st by high-level Israeli and Palestinian negotiators. It's called the Geneva Accords. It's a detailed proposal for a two-state settlement pretty much along the international border with mutual adjustments and so on. That's pretty much in accord with an overwhelming international consensus that has been in place for 30 years. The United States for 30 years, in fact, has unilaterally blocked a settlement along those lines. In fact, at Geneva, governments of the world sent messages of support and delegations and so on, but as the New York Times correctly reported, one government was conspicuous by its absence, the United States. Well, if the United States is conspicuous by its absence, it's not going to go forward. Now, it happens that proposal is in accord with the opinions of a large majority of Americans, and it goes way beyond that. But public opinion is just not operative in this domain. It doesn't have any representation in the political arena. Now, that takes us to the next question. The connection between the Likud party and the neocons here, that's real. In fact, two of the leading neocons, Richard Pearl and Douglas Feith, Pearl's now out of the government, Feith's still in, they were actually writing position papers for the extreme right wing of the Likud party back a couple of years ago. So yes, there's a connection. On the other hand, I wouldn't exaggerate it. I think that the there are strong domestic lobbies opposing a political settlement, but actually the biggest one by far is the Christian evangelicals in voting numbers. They don't happen to have much political representation, but they're a very big voting bloc.
Professor Chomsky, we actually have a caller who is sort of following up on your thoughts on Christian evangelicals.
Yeah.
Got Masood in San Jose. Welcome to your call.
Yes. Hi, Professor Chomsky. I'm an admirer of your work. I've been reading it since the mid-'80s. But one question I had is, what is your opinion about evangelical Christian support for Bush? How will that consolidate or unravel? Often when I listen to Bush's speeches, it makes a great deal of sense when I put myself in an evangelical Christian shoes, although from a rationalist perspective, it doesn't make much sense.
Now, there's a reason for that. I mean, the people who write Bush's speeches and give them to him and train them to read them, they understand that this is a huge voting bloc. Therefore, they put him forth as a religious extremist. He has a straight line to God, and so on and so forth. And that's a straight appeal to a big voting bloc. The United States happens to be an unusually fundamentalist religious culture, not like other industrial societies. And it's been understood, actually since the Carter administration, that that's a big block of voters you can mobilize. They don't affect policy very much, but the government does kind of throw them some red meat to keep them in line. One of the reasons, for example, why that's one of the reasons why the Bush administration is so strongly anti-choice, for abortion rights and so much opposed to it. It's one of the reasons why the United States is falling behind so radically behind the rest of the world at one of the frontiers of what's going to be the science and technology of the future, namely stem cell research. This is essentially throwing red meat to the evangelical community. And there's more. But these people who are doing it, I mean, they're not Christian evangelicals. Maybe a few of them are, but they're rational, secular planners who believe in power and violence and want to impose their will on the world that way. This is the way they organize a voting bloc. I think it's extremely dangerous. When you have a political leader with a straight line to God, you're in trouble.
All right, Professor Chomsky, just wanted to wrap up this wonderful chance to speak with you with another reference to your book, Hegemony and Survival. One critical question that you pose is, you say, we're entering a period of human history that may provide an answer to the question of whether it is better to be smart than stupid. It sounds like you're beginning to doubt whether human intelligence can save us from our own self-destructive impulses. Well, we actually don't know. I was quoting there one of the most famous biologists in the world who pointed out that the evolutionary evidence does not suggest that intelligence is of selectional value. I mean, the most successful species are, beetles and bacteria and so on. And he was raising the question whether, exactly the question you raised, will human intelligence destroy us, or will it lead to a solution for the problems that are around us? Now, every one of those problems, whatever it is, nuclear weapons, Israel-Arab conflict, terror, and so on, every one of them has, or health care in the United States. I mean, just run through the list. They all have pretty sensible solutions. The question is whether we can dedicate ourselves with enough commitment to ensure that those reasonable solutions will develop and that we will lay the basis for a much more democratic society in the future, which will not only preserve the possibilities of a decent life, but will also empower people to control their own destiny instead of being tools of centralized power. That's within our capacities. The question is whether it's within our will. That is a massive question that we must answer quickly in order to survive. Yeah. Noam Chomsky, Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT Linguistics, and the author of the new book, Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance. You can pick it up. It's out now from Metropolitan Books. We thank you so much, Professor Chomsky, for joining us. Thank you very much for having me. All right. Take care of yourself and keep writing. Okay. I'll be back with some closing thoughts, and I'll let you know what we have in store for you tomorrow. The clock is ticking. That's the final line of the report of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. They maintain the doomsday clock, a symbolic representation of how close the arms race has come to eliminating the human race. Right now, the clock is set at 7 minutes to midnight, but it's been as close as 2 minutes to chiming our doom. So we're bound to be afraid, especially because this week the Bush administration announced that a new terrorist attack on the United States was imminent, but when, where, by whom are still unclear. In his speech, 9/11 and the Uses of Fear, media critic Soot Jolly pointed out that fear is both useful and dangerous. It's useful when it makes us protect ourselves. It's dangerous when our idea of protection is xenophobia, warmongering, even genocide. There is more to fear than fear itself, but in the face of vague threats, we must avoid striking out blindly in rage and search our way towards peace.